Before the Civil War, the federal government possessed information it was never meant to have. Your name, your address, and roughly how often you mailed someone in another state. Before start, I request you to subscribe to my channel for more videos, and do let me know where from you are listening this video. So let's talk about it. This wasn't due to a census or tax roll. It was because of the mail. Between the 1830s and 1869, the U.S. Post Office maintained a system of postmaster account books so precise and geographically detailed that the few historians who have studied surviving fragments call them the most accurate population. Records of the 19th century, more reliable than the decennial census, more thorough than church registers, and more valuable to economists than anything the federal government officially claimed to be tracking at the time. Then, between 1008, 169 and 1008, 172, nearly all of them vanished. What those records contained, why they disappeared, and who benefited from their absence is a story that revisionist economic historians have been quietly piecing together for decades. The answer challenges something fundamental about how we narrate the history of American capitalism. To grasp what was lost, you must first understand what the post office truly was before railroads took over. Most people today picture the 19th century post office as a quaint relic, horseback riders, wax, sealed handwritten letters, a slow, romantic institution for the literate and wealthy. That image is almost entirely wrong. Subscribe to my channel for more videos. By 1840, the United States had more post offices than any country on earth. Over 13,000 scattered from coastal commercial cities to frontier settlements not yet on federal maps. Historian Richard John, in his landmark study, called it the largest organizational undertaking the American state had ever attempted. At its pre-Civil War peak, the post office employed more federal workers than the military. And because every postmaster had to submit quarterly accounts to Washington, the federal government accumulated something extraordinary, a running quarter-by-quarter record of economic activity in nearly every inhabited U.S. community. These weren't mere delivery logs. Postmasters recorded letter volumes sent and received, postage collected, names of individuals with uncollected mail, those paying overdue fees, and in many districts, names attached to credit accounts with the local postal agent. In rural areas, especially where banks were scarce and personal credit was hyper-local, these records were often the only written documentation of financial relationships within a community. For historians trying to reconstruct pre-industrial America's economic landscape, they are irreplaceable. They show who traded with whom, which towns were commercially active or isolated, migration patterns via mail forwarding, the rise and fall of small enterprises through changes in commercial correspondence, and in surviving district records, merchants corresponding with suppliers across 3 or 4 states, managing complex supply chains through personal correspondence years before the first telegraph wire arrived. In a real sense, these books were the closest thing to a living map of the American economy before instant communication and the collapse of geographic distance. So, where did they go? The answer starts in 1869, when Ulysses Grant appointed John Creswell of Maryland as Postmaster General. Creswell was a serious reformer, genuinely interested in efficiency, modernization, and reducing corruption, all of which the post office desperately needed. The system had accumulated decades of bureaucratic dead weight. Regional postmasters operated with enormous autonomy, accounting practices varied wildly, and there was no uniform record-keeping, centralized archive, or systematic preservation process. Creswell launched what he called a comprehensive administrative reorganization. Old account books were to be reviewed, consolidated, and if deemed redundant or operationally irrelevant, disposed of. The phrase "from surviving internal correspondence" is telling, cleared from the active files. The reorganization also aligned with a physical reality that made destruction easy to justify. The Post Office Department in Washington had been in overcrowded facilities for years. Storage was a genuine problem. When Creswell's team moved to new quarters starting in 1869, mid-level administrators made quick decisions about what traveled and what stayed, with no systematic review of historical value. The dead letter office records alone, accumulated over 3 decades, took up more space than the entire U.S. Army's personnel files. Exactly what was cleared and on whose authority is where the historical record grows murky. Researchers at the National Archives report a gap in postal collections that's hard to explain by ordinary administrative attrition. Routine documents from the 1870s onwards survive in volume. Those from the 1840s and 1850s exist in scattered fragments. But the decades between roughly 1836 to 1869, the period of most intensive economic expansion and settlement in American history, are represented by a collection so thin that archivists have repeatedly flagged it as anomalous. It's not a clean gap. Some records survive, enough to confirm what the complete record would have contained, but not enough to reconstruct it. This is where the revisionist argument gets uncomfortable for the standard telling of American economic history. The standard story goes, the post-Civil War period was one of creative economic destruction. Railroads unified the national market, industrial capital consolidated production. Small local economies were absorbed into larger regional and national systems. Some got rich, some displaced, but the overall trajectory was growth, progress, modernization. The records that survived were almost entirely those kept by the winners' railroad companies, large commercial banks, industrial firms, federal land agencies that transferred public land to private developers. Those records form the documentary foundation for most of what we think we know about 19th century American economic life. What the postal records would have shown, if intact, is the economy that existed before that consolidation. And the surviving fragments suggest it looked very different from the story the winners told. Economic historian David Henkin, in his research on 19th century postal culture, found consistent evidence of a far more distributed commercial landscape than the standard narrative allows. Small-scale producers corresponding directly with distant buyers without intermediary merchants. Cooperative credit arrangements managed through chains of personal correspondence outside the formal banking system. Local currencies, barter agreements, and debt arrangements, whose existence we can only infer from postal records because no bank ever wrote them down. This was not a primitive economy waiting to be modernized. It was a functional, adaptive economic ecosystem built on direct correspondence and personal trust networks. The railroad and banking consolidation of the Gilded Age did not simply improve upon it. In many respects, it dismantled it. The people who benefited most from that dismantling had strong reasons to prefer that the earlier system leave as few records as possible. A comprehensive postal archive from the 1840s and 1850s would have made visible, in painful statistical detail, the scale of displacement that accompanied industrialization. The severed commercial relationships, collapsed local credit networks, absorbed or destroyed small enterprises. It would have created an evidentiary baseline against which the Gilded Age could have been measured and found wanting. This is not a claim that someone ordered the records burned. The historical evidence doesn't support that, and responsible revisionist historians are careful to say so. What the evidence does support is something more insidious, a culture of administrative indifference toward records that memorialized a pre-industrial economy operating inside an institution being reshaped to serve an industrial one. The people deciding what to preserve and what to clear were not neutral archivists. They were political appointees inside a federal government that, in this exact period, was making enormous grants to railroad companies, restructuring the national banking system, and overseeing one of the largest transfers of public land to private ownership in world history. They weren't hostile to the old records exactly. They simply didn't value them. And in a bureaucracy with limited storage, limited staff, and explicit instructions to modernize, things that aren't valued get cleared. The result is a hole in the historical record that has quietly and persistently shaped every serious attempt to understand American economic development. When economists model 19th century growth, they work from the records that survived. When historians describe pre-industrial economic life, they work from the records that survived. When policymakers invoke the American past to argue for or against economic intervention, they invoke a past documented almost entirely by the institutions that replace the one that was lost. What fragments remain are revealing in proportion to their scarcity. A collection of postmaster account books from western Pennsylvania covering portions of 1848 through 1855 was discovered in a county historical society in the 1970s. Researchers found correspondence volumes implying commercial networks 3 to 4 times more active than standard economic histories had assumed, small iron producers corresponding with buyers in Philadelphia and Baltimore via direct arrangements, bypassing the major commercial agents whose records do survive. That network was dense, locally rooted, and quite resilient until the railroad arrived and reorganized it out of existence. A separate collection from southern Ohio, 1841, 1858, showed seasonal commercial correspondence tracking agricultural cycles with extraordinary precision, but also something else, letters to and from what appear to be cooperative purchasing arrangements, groups of small farmers pooling correspondence with distant suppliers to negotiate bulk pricing. That's the kind of economic behavior we would call collective bargaining or cooperative procurement in the 20th century, operating quietly through the mail in the 1840s, leaving almost no trace, except in these account books. The volume figures also suggest the local postmaster extended informal credit to regular correspondence, acting as a financial institution in a county where the nearest chartered bank was 40 miles away. This was probably standard practice across hundreds of rural districts, but we can only confirm it where the records accidentally survived. Both collections are extraordinary, both are tiny, and both survived by accident deposited in local archives by private individuals with no particular reason to preserve or destroy them. The systematic record is gone. What does it mean to lose the record of an economy? In practical terms, the economy you can document becomes, by default, the economy that is treated as normal. The railroad economy, the banking economy, the corporate economy, the one with the paper trail, the distributed economy that preceded it, built on correspondence networks, local credit, and direct producer-to-buyer relationships, becomes, in the absence of its records, a kind of myth. Something historians can gesture toward, but not fully reconstruct. Something that, in any era's political arguments, can be dismissed as romantic or speculative because the documentation needed to defend it concretely simply isn't there. This is the real cost of what happened between 1869 and 1872. Not the loss of names and dates, but the loss of an evidentiary foundation for an alternative account of how the American economy worked, and what was sacrificed to build the one that replaced it. The post office knew every name, every route, every volume, every seasonal rhythm of a commercial world that no longer exists. And that world left almost no record of its own passing. Then the records disappeared, not with drama, not with conspiracy, just with the ordinary bureaucratic indifference of an institution that had already decided what it was building next, and had no use for what it was leaving behind. Subscribe to my channel for more videos. The question worth sitting with is simple. If those records had survived intact, systematically preserved the way railroad company ledgers, bank records, or federal land grant documents were, what would our understanding of American capitalism look like today? What economic arrangements that we treat as inevitable would turn out to have been choices? What alternatives that we treat as naively premodern would turn out to have been, on their own terms, sophisticated and functional and deliberately displaced? We cannot answer those questions with the record we have. That is precisely and uncomfortably the point. The post office knew every name. That knowledge is gone, and the history we tell in its absence, whether we acknowledge it or not, is a history shaped by that absence. If this kind of buried economic history is something you want to keep pulling on, the next video looks at another set of vanished records that economists still argue about today. Same era, different institution, and an eraser that, unlike this one, actually did leave behind a paper trail of who ordered it. That one is on screen.